Stop. Watch this before you sell your silver. Because somewhere, right now, a coin shop counter is quietly deciding your silver is worth less. Not because the metal has changed, but because of what's stamped on it. 2 identical ounces. Same purity, same weight. One walks out with top dollar. The other gets shoved into a bin marked generic. And the person selling it, they never even see it coming. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that happens, and how to make sure it never happens to you. Welcome back to Precious Metals Intelligence, the channel built for those who don't just collect wealth, but understand it. Whether you've been stacking silver for decades, or you're simply protecting what you've already earned, this analysis is for you. Before we go further, take a moment and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from today? It always means a great deal to see just how far this community reaches. There's a belief that many silver owners carry with them for years, often without ever questioning it. They believe that 1 ounce of pure silver is the same as any other ounce of pure silver. After all, the numbers do not lie. If the purity reads 999 or higher, then the metal inside should be worth the same, no matter where it came from or what it looks like. This belief feels logical, it feels fair, and for a long time it goes unchallenged. But this belief is not entirely true, not in practice, not at the counter where silver changes hands for real money. Across coin shops and bullion dealers, in cities large and small, a quiet system operates beneath the surface. It does not appear in any official rulebook. It is not printed on a sign or explained up front. Yet it shapes almost every transaction involving physical silver. Analysts and longtime industry observers have come to call this system an aesthetic hierarchy. It is a way of ranking silver, not by its actual content, but by how it looks, who made it, and how familiar it feels to the person buying it back. 2 people can walk into 2 different shops on the same day, each carrying 1 ounce of pure silver. On paper, their metal is identical. The weight matches, the purity matches, yet one of them may walk out with significantly more money than the other. The difference has nothing to do with the silver itself. It has everything to do with the shape it takes, the name stamped on its surface, and the story that shape tells the dealer standing behind the counter. This is the part most people never see coming. They assume that silver is judged purely by its chemistry. They assume that a scale and a purity test are the only things that matter. But dealers operate in a different world, one shaped by resale value, buyer demand, and market trust. In that world, appearance carries weight. A coin that looks official, that carries a recognized government stamp, feels safer to a dealer than a plain, unbranded piece of metal, even if both are equally pure. It would be easy to assume this is a form of dishonesty, that dealers are simply trying to trick people out of their money. But the reality is more complicated and, in some ways, more human. Dealers are not silver enthusiasts sitting behind that counter out of passion alone. They are business owners. They have overhead costs, storage costs, and buyers of their own to satisfy. Every purchase they make from a seller is eventually resold to someone else, and that resale value depends heavily on how easily the next buyer will trust what they are looking at. This is where the aesthetic hierarchy begins to make a strange kind of sense. A well-known coin, minted by a respected government, sells itself. A dealer can turn it around quickly, with confidence, and without much explanation needed. A plain, unmarked piece of silver, no matter how pure, requires more effort. It may need to be explained, verified, or justified to the next buyer. That extra effort translates into lower offers at the counter, even though the raw metal inside has not changed at all. For the average seller, this system remains invisible until the moment it directly affects them. They walk in expecting a straightforward exchange, one built purely on weight and purity. Instead, they encounter judgment calls they did not know existed. Judgment calls based on branding, on visual condition, on how trustworthy their silver appears to be, rather than what it actually contains. This is not a story about a single dishonest transaction. It is a story about a structure, one that operates quietly across the entire industry, largely unnoticed by the people it affects the most. It rewards familiarity, it penalizes uncertainty, and it treats appearance as if it were a measurable form of value, even when the underlying material tells a completely different story. Understanding this is the first step. Without it, sellers remain vulnerable to a system they cannot see and therefore cannot challenge. With it, a very different kind of conversation becomes possible, one where the seller understands exactly why they are being offered a certain price, and whether that price truly reflects what they are holding. To understand how deep this hierarchy runs, it becomes necessary to look closer at how it is actually structured. Because underneath this general idea of aesthetic value lies a very specific, almost invisible ranking system, one that quietly places every piece of silver into a category long before a seller ever reaches the counter. Picture a filing cabinet that no customer is ever allowed to open. Inside it, every type of silver in existence has already been sorted, labeled, and ranked long before a single seller walks through the door. This cabinet does not exist in the physical sense. It exists in the mind of the dealer, built through years of experience, training, and market habit. Yet its effect on a transaction is just as real as any paper record. This is the tier system, and once a person understands it, they begin to see the silver market in a completely different way. At the very top of this system sits what could be called the first tier. This tier includes silver coins produced by recognized national governments. Coins like the American silver eagle, the Canadian maple leaf, and the Australian kangaroo fall into this category. These coins carry something that plain silver does not carry on its own: institutional trust. A government mint stands behind them. Their design is consistent. Their history is well documented. Because of this, dealers view them as the easiest silver to resell. Buyers recognize them instantly without needing convincing. This trust translates directly into higher buyback offers, often very close to the actual spot price of silver. Just below this sits the second tier. This tier includes silver rounds produced by private mints that still carry a clear brand name. These are not government coins, but they are not unknown either. A private company has stamped its name onto the metal, taking responsibility for its purity and production. Because there is a name attached, and often a reputation behind that name, dealers treat the silver with a moderate level of trust. It is not treated as generic, but it is also not treated with the same confidence as a government-issued coin. The buyback price sits somewhere in the middle, higher than raw scrap, but lower than sovereign coins. Then comes the third tier, the one that causes the most confusion and frustration for everyday sellers. This tier includes silver that carries no clear brand, silver that shows visible wear or spotting, and older vintage pieces whose origin may not be immediately obvious. In the eyes of many dealers, this silver becomes harder to place. It cannot be resold with the same instant confidence as a name product. It may require extra explanation, extra verification, or simply extra effort to convince the next buyer of its value. Because of this added friction, dealers offer the lowest prices for silver in this category, sometimes even below the current spot price. What makes this system so easy to overlook is that it has nothing to do with the actual composition of the metal. A person holding a plain, unbranded round with 999 fine silver content is holding the same raw material as someone holding a government-issued coin of the same weight. Chemically, there is no difference, yet the market treats them as though they exist in entirely separate categories. This is not a flaw in the system by accident. It is the system working exactly as it was built to work. It would be a mistake, however, to view every dealer using this tier system as acting out of pure self-interest or dishonesty. Many are simply responding to the same pressures that shape any resale business. They need to move inventory quickly. They need buyers who trust what they are purchasing. And branded, recognizable silver simply moves faster and with less resistance than something unfamiliar. In that sense, the tier system reflects a business reality more than a personal judgment about any individual seller. Still, for the seller standing at the counter, none of this context is offered up front. They are not told that their silver has been mentally placed into a lower tier before the conversation even begins. They are simply given a number, often without explanation, and left to decide whether to accept it or walk away. This is precisely why understanding the tier system matters so deeply. Once a person knows that this invisible ranking exists, they are no longer reacting blindly to a price. They can begin to ask better questions. They can begin to understand why one piece of silver in their collection may be treated so differently from another, even when both came from the same original investment decision. But knowing the tiers is only part of the picture. To fully understand how the system plays out in real transactions, it becomes necessary to examine the specific tactics used at the counter itself, tactics designed to justify lower offers long after the tier has already been silently assigned. Once silver has already been placed into its invisible tier, the conversation at the counter rarely feels like a negotiation. It feels more like a verdict being delivered. And behind that verdict, dealers rely on a small set of recurring tactics, tools they may not even consciously think of as tactics, but which shape the outcome of nearly every transaction involving anything other than a well-known coin. Understanding these tactics is where the average seller finally begins to gain real footing. The first of these is what might be described as the refinery justification. When a dealer receives a batch of mixed, unbranded, or older silver, they will often explain that this material cannot simply be resold as is. They will say it needs to be melted down, tested, or sent off to a refinery before it holds any real value to them. This explanation sounds technical. It sounds reasonable. And in some cases, it is completely true. Certain types of silver genuinely do get processed this way, but this justification is also used far more broadly than the actual refining process requires. Many pieces described this way never actually leave the shop. They are cleaned up, placed in a display case, and sold to the next customer at a healthy markup, without ever seeing the inside of a furnace. The seller, however, has already accepted a lower price based on the assumption that extra costs were unavoidable. The second tactic centers on cosmetic condition, and in particular, something known as milk spotting. These are cloudy, whitish marks that sometimes appear on the surface of silver, usually caused during the manufacturing process itself, long before the silver ever reached its owner. Visually, these marks can look unpleasant, but they do not affect the purity or the weight of the metal in any meaningful way. Despite this, dealers often treat milk spots as though they represent a serious flaw, something closer to damage than a simple cosmetic issue. A round covered in these marks may be pushed straight into the lowest tier, priced as scrap, while a government coin with similar marks might be quietly overlooked and still treated with full trust. The inconsistency reveals something important. The flaw is not really about the spots themselves, it is about which category of silver they happen to appear on. The third tactic is perhaps the most difficult for sellers to notice in the moment, because it plays out over time rather than in a single conversation. This is sometimes referred to as collector amnesia. It occurs when older or historically interesting silver pieces, ones that could reasonably be considered collectible, are evaluated at the counter as though they hold no special value at all. The dealer treats the item as plain, generic material, offering a price based purely on melt value. Yet shortly after, that same piece may reappear in the shop's display case, now marked as a rare or desirable find, priced well above what was paid for it. The seller never sees this second chapter of the story. They only experience the undervaluing, without ever learning what happened to their silver afterward. None of these three tactics require a dealer to lie outright. Each one can be explained using language that sounds professional, cautious, and even reasonable on the surface. This is precisely what makes them so effective. A seller who does not know better has no reason to question a phrase like, "This needs to go to a refinery," or "These spots lower its resale value." The explanation sounds like expertise, not manipulation. But once a person understands how these tactics function, the entire dynamic at the counter begins to shift. They start to recognize when a justification is being used selectively, applied to one type of silver, but conveniently ignored for another. They begin to ask direct questions instead of accepting explanations at face value. And most importantly, they stop assuming that every reason given for a lower offer is automatically true simply because it sounds official. This shift in awareness does not make dealers into villains. It simply restores balance to a conversation that was never truly equal to begin with. The dealer walks into every transaction with years of experience and a clear understanding of these tactics. The average seller walks in with none of that context, relying entirely on trust. What remains to be understood, however, is not just how these tactics work individually, but what they add up to over time. Because a single lower offer may seem like a minor inconvenience in the moment, repeated across years and across every transaction a person makes, the pattern tells a very different and far more costly story. A single transaction rarely feels significant on its own. A seller walks in with a handful of silver rounds, hears an explanation about milk spots or refinery costs, accepts a slightly lower number than expected, and walks out. In isolation, this moment seems small. It might amount to a difference of a few dollars or perhaps a little more. Most people shrug it off and move on with their day, never thinking about it again. But silver ownership is rarely a single event. For most people, it is a habit built over years, sometimes decades. They buy a little here, sell a little there, pass pieces down, or slowly convert their stack into cash as life circumstances change. And this is where the real story begins to reveal itself. Because the small gap between what a piece of silver is truly worth and what a seller actually receives does not happen once. It happens again and again, quietly, across every transaction where the seller does not fully understand the system working against them. Consider someone who sells silver only a handful of times over the course of their life. Each time, they lose a modest percentage of value simply because their silver was placed into a lower tier, or because a cosmetic flaw was treated as though it were a structural one. On its own, each loss feels forgettable, but added together across a lifetime, the total becomes far more substantial than most people ever realize. This is not a dramatic loss that happens all at once. It is a slow, steady erosion, the kind that never triggers alarm because it never arrives as a single large number. This is precisely what makes the aesthetic hierarchy so effective as a system. It does not need to take a large amount from any one person during any one visit. It only needs to take a small amount consistently from a very large number of people who never stop to question it. Multiply that small amount across an entire industry, across countless transactions, happening every single day in coin shops around the world, and the scale becomes difficult to ignore. For the individual seller, the real danger is not any one dealer or any one shop. The danger is repetition without awareness. Someone who does not understand the tier system or the tactics used to justify lower offers will likely make the same mistake every time they sell. They will accept the same kinds of explanations, assume the same reasoning is fair, and walk away slightly undervalued over and over again without ever realizing a pattern exists. This is why awareness matters so much more than any single transaction. Knowledge does not simply help someone avoid being shortchanged once, it changes how every future transaction unfolds. A seller who understands these tactics approaches the counter differently. They ask different questions. They notice inconsistencies they would have previously overlooked. And over time, this shift in understanding can meaningfully change the outcome of their financial decisions, not through some dramatic reversal, but through the steady accumulation of fairer outcomes across many small moments. What began as a simple question, whether all silver is truly equal, now reveals itself as something much larger. It is a question about awareness, about the quiet systems that operate beneath ordinary transactions, and about how much value can slip away simply because someone did not know what to look for. Before moving into the final part of this analysis, where the actual strategies used by informed sellers will be laid out clearly, take a moment to consider your own experience. Have you ever walked away from a transaction sensing that something did not quite add up without being able to explain exactly why? If this analysis has helped clarify a system you may have never fully understood before, consider staying connected to precious metals intelligence. And once again, it would mean a great deal to know where you are watching from today. The final part of this story is where everything changes, where the seller stops reacting and starts negotiating from a position of knowledge.